generations of Indians who are so eager to receive authentic information and knowledge about Netaji and his life of struggle. In conclusion, I would like to relate to you Krishna Bose's last conversation with Netaji's life partner, Emilie Schenkel, shortly before Emilie passed away in 1996. Both Krishna and Shishir Bose had a very close bond with Emilie, whom we called Auntie. Emilie, then 85, was keeping poor health and had been temporarily admitted to a nursing home in Bavaria, Germany. Concerned, Krishna called her up in the nursing home. Concerned, Krishna called her up in the nursing home. Krishna has recounted the conversation in her book Emilie and Subhas, A True Love Story, published in English in 2016, Bengali in 2017, and Hindi in 2020. In Krishna Bose's words, I called her up in her room in the nursing home. This is in early 1996. She sounded feeble and distressed. When she heard my voice, she said, Krishna, I want to thank you. I did not understand. I tried to remember if I had sent any present for her lately, as I did from time to time, but I could not remember sending anything of late. Then she said again, I thank you and Shishir for all that you did. My heart sank. I replied, Auntie, Shishir and I will come and see you soon. She repeated, thank you for all that you did. January 2022 marks the centenary, 100 years, of the poem Bidrohi by Kazi Nazrul Islam. May I now invite Srimati Brototi Bandopadhyay to come up on the dais and recite that celebrated poem for all of us.
এলগিন রোডের এই বাড়ি থেকে তুমি চলে যাবার পর ৮১টা শীত বর্ষা গ্রীষ্ম উধাও। এখনো প্রতি জানুয়ারিতে তোমার নশ্বর পায়ের ছাপ। তোমার গন্তব্য ছিল স্বাধীনতা, তোমার পথ ছিল স্বাধীনতা, তোমার প্রেম ছিল স্বাধীনতা। স্বাধীনতা সংগ্রামের সেই অগ্নিপুরুষকে, নেতাজি সুভাষচন্দ্র বসুকে আমার শ্রদ্ধা। ইতিহাসের পাতা থেকে বেরিয়ে আসে সব আশ্চর্য তথ্য। কাজী নজরুল ইসলাম এবং নেতাজি সুভাষচন্দ্র বসু প্রায় সমসাময়িক। একজন 1897 আর একজন 1899। পরস্পরের গভীর অনুরাগী ছিলেন তাঁরা। কাজী নজরুলের এক সংবর্ধনা সভায় নেতাজি বলেছিলেন, যুদ্ধক্ষেত্রে যেমন আমরা নজরুলের গান গাই, কারাগারের ভেতরেও আমরা নজরুলের গান গাই। 1921 ডিসেম্বরের শেষ সপ্তাহে কাজী নজরুল 3/4C তারাতলা রোডের বাড়িতে বসে লিখলেন বিদ্রোহী কবিতা। মাঝরাতে ঘুম থেকে উঠে বসে লিখতে শুরু করলেন। ভোর রাতে সেই লেখা শেষ হলো। শোনালেন তাঁর রুমমেট মুজাফফর আহমেদকে। সেই কবিতা প্রথম প্রকাশিত হয় 1922 জানুয়ারির 6 তারিখে বিজলী পত্রিকায়। আশ্চর্যজনকভাবে ইতিহাস মিলিয়ে দিয়েছে দুই মহাপুরুষকে। একজনের জন্মবার্ষিকীর 125তম বছর, আর একজনের এক ঐতিহাসিক কবিতার 100 বছর। সেই বিদ্রোহী কবিতার একটি নির্বাচিত অংশ আমি শোনাচ্ছি। বলবীর বল উন্নত মম শির, শির নেহারি আমারি নত শির ওই শিখর হিমাদ্রি। বলবীর বল মহাবিশ্বের মহাকাশ ফাড়ি, চন্দ্র সূর্য গ্রহ তারা ছাড়ি, দুলোক ভুলোক গোলক ভেদিয়া, খোদার আসন আরশ ছেদিয়া, উঠিয়াছি চির বিস্ময় আমি বিশ্ববিধাত্রীর। মম ললাটে রুদ্র ভগবান, জলে রাজ রাজ টিকা দীপ্ত জয়শ্রীর। বলবীর আমি চির উন্নত শির, আমি চির দুর্দম দুর্বিনীত নৃশংস, মহাপ্রলয়ের আমি নটরাজ, আমি সাইক্লোন, আমি ধ্বংস, আমি মহাভয়, আমি অভিশাপ পৃথ্বী, আমি দুর্বার, আমি ভেঙে করি সব চুরমার। আমি অনিয়ম উচ্ছৃঙ্খল, আমি দলে যাই যত বন্ধন, যত নিয়ম কানুন শৃঙ্খল। আমি মানি না কোনো আইন, আমি ভরা তরি করি ভরা ডুবি, আমি টর্পেডো, আমি ভীম ভাসমান মাইন। আমি ধূর্যটি, আমি এলোকে সে ঝড় অকাল বৈশাখীর। আমি বিদ্রোহী, আমি বিদ্রোহী সুত বিশ্ববিধাত্রীর। বলবীর আমি চির উন্নত শির, আমি ঝঞ্ঝা, আমি ঘূর্ণি, আমি পথ সম্মুখে যাহা পাই যাই চূর্ণি। আমি নৃত্য পাগল ছন্দ, আমি আপনার তালে নেচে যাই, আমি মুক্ত জীবনানন্দ। আমি হাম্বীর, আমি ছায়ানট, আমি হিন্দোল, আমি চলচঞ্চল ঠমকি ছমকি, পথে যেতে যেতে চকিতে চমকি, ফিং দিয়া দি তিনদোল। আমি চপলা চপল হিন্দোল, আমি তাই করি ভাই যখন চাহে মন যা, করি শত্রুর সাথে গলাগলি, ধরি মৃত্যুর সাথে পাঞ্জা। আমি উন্মাদ, আমি ঝঞ্ঝা, আমি মহামারী, আমি ভীতিয়ে ধরিত্রীর। আমি শাসন ত্রাসন সংহার, আমি উষ্ণ চির অধীর। বলবীর আমি চির উন্নত শির, আমি বন্ধন হারা কুমারীর বেণী, তন্নি নয়নে বহ্নি। আমি ষোড়শীর হৃদি সরসিজ প্রেম উদ্দাম, আমি ধন্যী, আমি উন্মন মৌন উদাসীর। আমি বিধবার বুকে ক্রন্দন শ্বাস, হাহুতাস আমি হুতাশীর। আমি বঞ্চিত ব্যথা পথবাসী, চিরগৃহহারা যত পথিকের। আমি অবমানিতের মরম বেদনা, বিষ জ্বালা প্রিয় লাঞ্ছিত বুকে গতি ফের। আমি অভিমানী, চিরক্ষুব্ধ হিয়ার, কাতরতা ব্যথা শুনিবিড়। চিতচুম্বন চোর কম্পন আমি, থর 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 প্রথম পরশ কুমারীর। আমি গোপন প্রিয়ার চকিত চাহনি, ছল করে দেখা অনুক্ষণ, আমি চপল মেয়ের ভালোবাসা, তার কাঁকন চুড়ির কনকন, আমি চির শিশু চির কিশোর, আমি যৌবন ভীতু পল্লী বালার আচর কাঁচলিনী চোর, আমি উত্তর বায়ুমলয়ে অনিল উদাস পুরবী হাওয়া, আমি পথিক কবির গভীর রাগিনী বেনুবিনে গান গাওয়া, আমি আকুল নিদাঘাতি আশা, আমি রৌদ্র রুদ্র রবি, আমি বরুণীর ঝড় ঝড় ঝড়, আমি শ্যামলিমা ছায়া ছবি, আমি তুরি আনন্দে ছুটে চলি, একি উন্মাদ আমি উন্মাদ, আমি সহসা আমারে চিনেছি আমার, খুলিয়া গিয়াছে সব বাঁক, মহাবিদ্রোহীর অনুক্লান্ত, আমি সেই দিন হব শান্ত, যবে উৎপীড়িতের ক্রন্দন রোল আকাশে বাতাসে ধ্বনিবে না, অত্যাচারীর খড়গ কৃপান ভীমের রণভূমে রণিবে না, বিদ্রোহীর অনুক্লান্ত, আমি সেই দিন হব শান্ত, আমি বিদ্রোহী ভৃগু ভগবান বুকে এঁকে দিই পদচিহ্ন, আমি স্রষ্টা সুদন শোকতাপহানা খেয়ালি বিধির বক্ষ করিব ভিন্ন, আমি বিদ্রোহী ভৃগু ভগবান বুকে এঁকে দেব পদচিহ্ন, আমি খেয়ালি বিধির বক্ষ করিব ভিন্ন, আমি চির বিদ্রোহী বীর, আমি বিশ্ব ছাড়ায়ে উঠিয়াছি একা চির উন্নত শির।
We have a token of appreciation for Bhatuti Bandopadhyay, the poetry collection Bir Bandana and Emilie o Subhash by Krishna Bose. On that rousing note, Professor Sugata Bose, chairperson of Netaji Research Bureau, will now speak on Netaji and Japan.
Friends from across the world, in March 1967, as a 10-year-old, I was witness to a solemn ceremony held exactly at this venue. The atmosphere was electric as the Indian Army Band played Sare Jahan Se Acha Ye Hindustan Hamara. As the roll of drums subsided into silence, General Fujiwara Iwaichi of Japan presented Netaji's sword to Dr. Shishir Kumar Bose. The writing on the original wooden box read Haja Kensho, which means destroy evil and establish justice. On the occasion of the homecoming of Netaji's sword, Shishir Kumar Bose said, "Let us remember that the blood of Japanese and Indian youth mingled freely on the hills and ravines of India's northeast frontier, so that India and Asia may be liberated once and for all from the shackles of Western imperialism. That common blood sacrifice, more than anything else, has forged an indissoluble unity and friendship among the Japanese and the Indian peoples. Let us record on this momentous occasion what we as a state and as a people have neglected to do in adequate measure for too long. Let us record our gratitude to the people of Japan for the wonderful support they gave to India's freedom fighters and the honor they did to our leader during the crucial phase, the final phase of our battle for freedom." Bengal's Governor Padmaja Naidu added, "I would like to request General Fujiwara, who has so graciously come to India, to present this sword to the Netaji Museum, to convey to the people of Japan our gratitude not only for this gift, but for all other gifts they have given to our fight for independence. In presenting the Netaji Award today to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, we have reaffirmed the bond between India and Japan. As S.A. Iyer put it at the sword ceremony, Netaji Research Bureau is not probing into a dead past, but is engaging in projecting a dynamic past into the living present and the potential future. On April 28, 1943, Netaji's aide Abid Hassan had felt something akin to a homecoming when he and his leader transferred in a rubber boat from a German to a Japanese submarine in the Indian Ocean on their 90-day voyage from Europe to Asia. Immediately we had that feeling, he recalled decades later. Netaji had that feeling. The Germans, he explained, were very friendly, very courteous, but we did feel that we had come back to an Asian nation. The warmth of Japanese hospitality and the food spiced with Indian ingredients sourced from Penang were entirely to their liking. From Sabang in Sumatra, where their submarine had docked, Netaji and Abid Hassan flew to Japan in early May 1943. After meetings with poets and professors, generals and admirals, including Generals Arisue and Sugiyama, and the foreign minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, Netaji finally had a face-to-face meeting with Hideki Tojo on June 10, 1943. The magic of Bose, Joyce Lebra writes, enchanted Tojo immediately. With Netaji watching as a special guest, the Japanese premier declared his country's firm resolve to do everything possible to help Indian independence in a speech to the Diet on June 16, 1943. Speaking to 60 journalists on June 19th in Tokyo, Netaji spoke about reviving ancient cultural ties between India and Japan that had been interrupted because of the British domination of India. Yona Noguchi, who had known Binoy Kumar Sharkar and Rabindranath Tagore since the 1910s, now met Netaji and was deeply impressed. On June 20th, 1943, he composed a poem addressed to Subhas Chandra Bose, which is published in Bir Bandana. The next day, Indians in Southeast Asia heard Netaji's stirring broadcast calling upon all patriotic Indians to advance towards the field of battle. Only when the blood of freedom-loving Indians begins to flow, he declared, will India attain her freedom. Accompanied by the veteran revolutionary Rashbihari Bose, Subhas Chandra Bose and Abid Hassan arrived in Singapore on July 2nd, 1943. On July 4th, Rashbihari offered Subhas as his present to the enthusiastic assembly of Indians in the Cathay Theatre. Accepting the leadership of the Indian independence movement in Southeast and East Asia, Netaji offered those who were prepared to follow him nothing but hunger, thirst, privation, forced marches, and death, until they held their victory parade at the Red Fort of Delhi. The following morning, July 5th, on the expansive green in front of Singapore's municipal building with its Corinthian columns, Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose took the salute as Supreme Commander of the Indian National Army. And he gave the war cry, Chalo Delhi. Expatriate Indians, soldiers and civilians alike responded with great emotional fervor to his call for total mobilization. Subhas Chandra Bose was a man you could not forget once you knew him. So wrote the Burmese leader Barmore. His greatness was manifest. He saw Netaji as a symbol of the long and passionate Indian revolution that had at last found its way into the wider Asian revolution which could change Asia. Having galvanized Indian expatriate communities in Malaya, Thailand, and Burma between July and October, Netaji proclaimed the formation of the Azad Hind government in Singapore on October 21st, 1943. Once the Japanese government at a cabinet meeting on October 23rd granted recognition to the Free India government, the stage was set for his participation at the Greater East Asia Conference to be held in Tokyo on November 5th, 6th, 1943. The leaders of the Asian countries invited to the conference arrived as chrysanthemum flowers bloomed in Tokyo. Subhas Chandra Bose was hosted by the family of Shibusawa Shakuro, the head of Japan's central bank, whose father had pioneered the financial reforms of the Meiji era. Gazing at the Shingawa Gulf from the Shibusawa home in Shiba, Netaji reflected on the achievements of Meiji Japan and its 1905 victory. On November 3rd, he visited the Meiji Shrine to pay his respects on the anniversary of the adoption of the Meiji Constitution. Netaji had come as an observer, according to the Japanese Foreign Ministry's record, because he was of the opinion that India would not join the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Japanese opinion also concurred with his. Before the conference began, he made sure paintings and poetry that had helped forge bonds between India and Japan since the turn of the 20th century would figure prominently on his itinerary. He was deeply conscious of the friendship between Rabindranath and Okakura, as well as Abanindranath and Taikkan. Netaji visited the Ueno Museum of Art with Anand Mohan Sahai and Abid Hassan. Having learned that his war cry, Chalo Delhi, had inspired the composition of a Japanese song by Yon Noguchi for NHK, he asked for and received an English translation of the song Marching to Delhi. The first verse of this song poem, in 4 verses, visualized a freedom feast in a land ravaged by famine. On November 5th, 1943, the Assembly of the Greater East Asiatic Nations formally convened in the Japanese Diet. Subhas Chandra Bose rose to speak on the afternoon of November 6th, 1943. The force of his delivery, the Japanese record noted, compelled every member of the conference to pay attention to every phrase of his speech. A Cambridge-educated interpreter and diplomat, Masayoshi Kakitsubo, who had visited India in the mid-1930s and gave the Netaji oration here in 1977, was given the task of translating Netaji's speech. Krishna Bose writes in her book, Charonarekha Tabo, that decades later, Kakitsubo remembered being moved to tears as he rendered Netaji's English speech into Japanese. Surveying the long history of international conferences, Netaji recalled his own futile attempts to get a hearing for the cause of Indian independence before the League of Nations. It was the Indian inability to distinguish between false and real universalism, Netaji argued, that had led India to succumb to European power. But India had learned through misery and humiliation that true internationalism was rooted in nationalism. The first step towards the creation of an international society was to set up regional federations. He expressed his determination to fight till the bitter end, no matter what the suffering and sacrifice involved may prove to be, certain of India's ultimate victory. I do not know, he said, how many of us who are going to participate in the coming battle will survive to see India free. But whether we survive or not, whether we individually live to see India free or not, we are confident that India shall be free. The Japanese government responded by announcing the de jure transfer of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands to the Azad Hind government. The Asian leaders took their message beyond the conference halls to the mass rally held in Hibiya Park. Subhas Chandra Bose was given an audience by the Emperor of Japan in the Phoenix Hall of the Imperial Palace on November 10, 1943. Subhas called on Rashbihari Bose at his home, and together they attended a luncheon in his honor given by Mitsuru Toyama on November 15th. Netaji visited the 45 young cadets at the Tokyo Military Academy, and like a mother, he showered his heartfelt affection on them. By the time Netaji said goodbye to the Shibusawa family, leaving with them his presents, including the ceremonial samurai sword that is now at Netaji Bhaban, he had clearly endeared himself to his Japanese hosts and left a lasting impression on them. Netaji arrived in Nanjing on November 18, 1943, proceeding immediately to pay his homage at the mausoleum of Sun Yat-sen. On the night of November 20th, 1943, Netaji gave a 40-minute radio address to the Chungking government and the Chinese people. It contained a lengthy autobiographical account of the ways in which he studied the ideas of Sun Yat-sen and the history of China's Republican Revolution. He paid glowing tributes to Sun as a friend of India, a firm supporter of Indian independence, and a strong opponent of British imperialism. Sun was also a sincere believer in the liberation of Asia and in Asian unity. Following in the footsteps of three great men, C.R. Das, a great Indian leader, Sun Yat-sen, and Okakura of Japan, he declared, "I am seized and inspired by the idea of Pan-Asian Federation." Asia needed to pursue the twin values of liberation and unity, he argued. The building blocks of Asian liberation and unity were the unity of China and the freedom of India, which in turn would make the liberation of the oppressed peoples of West Asia possible. On November 21st, Netaji traveled from Nanjing to Shanghai and galvanized support for his Indian National Army. He issued a second appeal to Chungking, urging Chiang Kai-shek not to fight against India's Army of Liberation. He recalled how, as president of the Indian National Congress in 1938, he had sent an Indian medical mission to China. The mission had set off from this very house. And he insisted that the Indian people really sympathize with China and the Chinese people. Every Indian should be true to the cause of India, he insisted, and likewise every Chinese should be true to the cause of China. How to reconcile these patriotic allegiances with the larger aim of Asian unity was the severe challenge that wartime Asian leaders faced. Chiang Kai-shek had been rebuffed by Gandhi in 1942 when he had visited India on the eve of the Mahatma's Quit India movement as an advocate of Britain and the United States. Netaji reckoned in November 1943 that China would achieve unity under one leader and that by an honorable peace, Japan would withdraw her troops from China. He cited Mahatma Gandhi's statement in 1942 that if India were free, he would have gone on a mission to bring peace between China and Japan. Netaji asked Abid Hassan to stay on in China for a while to negotiate an understanding with the Chungking government, but to no avail. From China, Netaji flew on November 22, 1943, to the Philippines, whose leaders had blazed the trail to Japan since the days of Jose Rizal. One beautiful day in November 1943, an eyewitness recounted, Bose went to Luneta Park on Manila Beach to present a wreath at the famous statue of Jose Rizal. He gazed silently at the statue of Rizal for several long, tense minutes as the flag of Azad Hind, adorned with the charkha, fluttered in the morning breeze, and the flowers presented by Bose at the feet of the big statue made the whole scene extremely colorful. President Jose Laurel welcomed Subhas Chandra Bose in Manila as the leader of 350 million Indians in their effort, which is legitimate and divine, to free themselves from the British rule. In early January 1944, Netaji moved forward the headquarters of his Azad Hind government from Singapore to Rangoon in preparation for taking the War of Independence onto Indian soil. The war against the British forces began on the Arakan front in February, and with Chalo Delhi as their slogan, the Indian National Army crossed the Indo-Burma frontier on March 18, 1944, towards Imphal and Kohima. High hopes of capturing Imphal in April 1944 were dashed as American air support came to the aid of besieged British ground forces. The INA and their Japanese allies were forced to retreat beginning July 1944, even though the INA continued to fight rearguard battles against the British advance into Burma until April 1945. In the autumn of 1944, information trickled down unofficially from Japan that the Japanese government was desirous of conferring a title, Order of the Rising Sun of the First Merit, on Subhas Bose. His reply to this shocked the Japanese authorities not a little. Prem Kumar Saigal, Netaji's military secretary, remembered that the Japanese emissary to whom he conveyed his leader's refusal suggested that they both commit harakiri. I've heard this story from Prem Saigal myself. The Japanese Foreign Office has an account which I'll come to. Saigal politely declined the suicide pact, humorously, along with the decoration for his leader. The Japanese Foreign Office tells us in their record that Netaji said, when the independence of India became a reality, he would be glad to receive it, the award, along with his followers. For the time being, he would like to set it aside. Would not this incident and the other one in case of Shibusawa's presence recorded before, the Japanese account comments, reveal the very essence of his character? Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose traveled to Tokyo on his third and final visit on October 29, 1944, with Muhammad Zaman Kiani, A.C. Chatterjee, and Habibur Rahman, and spent a month in Japan. He held talks with the new Prime Minister, Kuniaki Koisu, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, and was received by Emperor Hirohito on November 6, 1944. Even if Japan is defeated, he told his followers, we shall fight for India's independence till the end. He lectured at Hibiya Hall and delivered a major, wide-ranging address to the faculty and students of Tokyo Imperial University. He argued that a regional order had to be the foundation of a world order. The League of Nations had failed because of the selfish and short-sighted policies of the sponsor nations, particularly Britain and France. If such selfishness and short-sightedness could be abjured in Asia, and the sponsor nation could work on a moral basis, the experiment to build a new international order may well succeed. He saw the challenge to rise to a high level of morality to be the task not just for leaders and politicians, but rather youths and the students. Having got the Japanese to send an ambassador, Teruo Hachiya, to his Azad Hind government, he commenced his return journey to Southeast Asia on November 29, 1944. On January 10, 1945, Netaji was back at the war front in Burma. On April 24, 1945, Netaji, along with the men and women of the Indian National Army, began an epic retreat on foot from Burma to Thailand. The movement sought to regroup in Thailand, Malaya, and Singapore until the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the war in Asia to an abrupt end. Once the warrior hero laid down his life for his country's freedom, his mortal remains found a peaceful resting place in a Buddhist temple in Japan. It was just a matter of a few months before Netaji and the INA turned their military defeat in Southeast Asia into a spectacular political victory in India. His friend Dilip Kumar Roy vividly describes how Subhash's suddenly amplified figure added to the romance of an Indian national army marching, singing to Delhi, galvanized a frustrated nation out of its torpor, and substantially damaged the insulation of the Indian army from the magnetic currents of popular enthusiasm for immediate independence. On November 5th, 1945, a trial by court-martial began of 3 INA officers, Prem Kumar Sahgal, Shahnawaz Khan, and Gurbaksh Singh Dhillon, at Delhi's historic Red Fort. A groundswell of popular support emerged for the Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh soldiers who faced the weighty charge of waging war against the King Emperor. Accounts of the heroic fight for freedom filled the pages of the Indian press. The masterful lead defense lawyer Bhulabhai Desai argued that the INA had waged war under a duly constituted government and in accordance with international law. If a subject people could not take up arms to throw off a foreign yoke, he contended, there would be nothing but perpetual slavery. On December 31st, 1945, the Red Fort Three were sentenced to deportation for life, just as the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, had been in 1858. 3 days later, on January 3rd, 1946, the British Commander-in-Chief, Claude Auchinleck, was forced to release them to a tumultuous welcome from the Indian public. Among the dozen witnesses presented by the defense were 5 Japanese diplomats and generals. I cannot forget the cheering crowds of Indians that night, a defense witness, Major General Tudashi Katakura, recalled, when the INA officers were vindicated and released. In December 1967, Netaji's sword was taken on a visit to Delhi's Red Fort. I traveled in the train with my father on that memorable journey. I watched in wonder as huge crowds gathered at Patna, Mughal Sarai, Allahabad, Kanpur, Ghaziabad, and smaller wayside stations as the relic wound its way across the Gangetic Plain. From Delhi station, the sword was taken in a gigantic procession to the Red Fort, with thousands of people lining the streets and showering flowers from balconies and treetops along the way. The sword was received in the Diwani arm by President Zakir Hussain, Vice President V.V. Giri, and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. So many of us who knew Netaji have assembled here today, Indira Gandhi said, with hearts laden with emotion. His slogan was onward to Delhi. He himself could not reach Delhi, but his sword has come here today, and we welcome it warmly. I can still remember when we were young and we looked into his inspired eyes, our hearts also filled up with fervor. We can therefore well understand how and with what fervor he organized the Azad Hind Fauj. Netaji's Cambridge friend C.C. Desai, MP, lamented, if only he was with us from 1945 to 1947, the history of this country might well have been different. He was held in greater esteem by the Muslims, particularly by the Muslims of India and Mr. Jinnah, than perhaps, and I do not want to say a disparaging word about anybody, any other leader, Congress or otherwise. And if he was concerned with the independence and the fashioning of the future of India, things might have been different. Another close associate of Netaji, Hari Vishnu Kamath MP, asserted, in world history, and particularly during World War II, there is none to equal his role as a warrior, philosopher, and statesman at the same time. He reminded the Red Fort audience of the strains of the war song of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose and his gallant Azad Hind Fauj. Let me close then with those immortal lines that can inspire our quest for freedom, even today. Chalo Dehli pukar ke, qawmi nishan samhal ke, लाल किले पे गाढ़ के लहराए जा चलो दिली पुकार के कौमी निशान संभाल के लाल किले पे गाढ़ के लहराए जा कदम कदम बढ़ाए जा खुशी के गीत गाए जा ये जिंदगी है कौम की तू कौम पे लुटाए जा कदम कदम बढ़ाए जा तू शेर हिंद आगे बढ़ मरने से फिर भी तू न डर उड़ा के दुश्मनों का सर जो शे वतन बढ़ाए जा कदम कदम बढ़ाए जा कदम कदम बढ़ाए जा चलो दिल्ली पुकार के कौमी निशान संभाल के लाल किले पे गाढ़ के लहराए जा कदम कदम बढ़ाए जा कदम कदम बढ़ाए जा कदम कदम बढ़ाए जा जय हिंद
We are now approaching the end of our program, but we have a finale befitting of Netaji's 125th birth anniversary. Most of you will remember the fabulous musical tribute to Netaji performed by T.M. Krishna and his colleagues in this auditorium just 2 years ago, 23rd January 2020. The Netaji Stadium was packed and overflowing, and I sat in the front row next of the audience, next to my mother, as T.M. Krishna enthralled us from this dais for almost 2 hours. For Netaji's 125th, T.M. Krishna's students have prepared a rendering of Subha Sukha Chainiki, the Azad Hind movement's anthem in Southeast Asia from 1943 to 1945, which is known as the Qaumi Tarana. The 3 men involved in writing the lyrics of the Qaumi Tarana and setting it to music in 1943 were Abid Hassan, Mumtaz Hussain, and Ram Singh Thakur. T.M. Krishna students have prepared a rendering of Subha Sukha Chainaki, the Azad Hind anthem, the Qaumi Tarana, in its original 1943 notation. They were looking forward to coming here from Chennai to perform live, but we will have to make do with a recording. The following artists have performed in the rendering of the Azad Hind anthem that you are about to hear. Piano, Rijul Chakravarti. Vocals, Aditya Prakash, Aditya Narayanan Shankar, Bhargavi Venkatram, Emmanuel Martin, Rithwik Raja, Shruti Ravali Manda, Thanmai Krishnamurti,